Welcome back to our live training session. We're going to be taking a look in this training module how to dial in our cold start warm-up enrichment style tuning, taking also a look at our fuel film tuning when the engine is actually warmed up here, and then finally some refinement to our drive-by-wire throttle control. So we have a lot of things to discuss and unpack here in this training module. So let's jump right in and talk about our cold start and warm-up enrichment style tuning. Now, the first thing we need to know is that we've dialed everything in on a warm engine. So idle, part throttle, wide open throttle, volumetric efficiency, spark timing, idle control, everything is good. Now, when we allow the engine to cool down overnight, so I've let the vehicle sit here overnight, we're going to find things change. Namely, we need to have additional fuel under cranking and warm-up enrichment when the engine's coming up to operating temperature so that the engine doesn't run lean. What we'll find is we have a wall wetting effect when the engine is cold, meaning it's going to have a lot of fuel that's going to stick to the intake track and the intake valve. It's not going to get into the engine as efficiently and atomize as well as what we find on a warm engine. So as a result, for each engine cycle, we're going to have less fuel being injected into the engine, or making its way into the engine, I should say. And therefore, we're going to run lean, and we need to go in and compensate by adding additional fuel. Now, we're going to be doing that in a couple different areas. We'll unpack that here in just 1 minute. Now, we also have the ability to alter our idle control. So we have drive-by-wire control here, and we know in our idle control tuning, we set up a base feed forward table. We have the ability to go in and actually make that table based on coolant temperature, so that when we're on a cold engine, we might want to go ahead and open the throttle blade a little bit more to be able to compensate. So we'll talk about that as well. Let's move from our area here under fuel tuning, and let's go and jump into our startup fuel. And let's talk about a few things here. So we're going to find here that we have a cranking fuel table. We have a cranking airflow, cranking spark timing, post-start fuel, and warm-up enrichment. Now, all of these are utilized, as well as our lambda ECT offset. We'll talk about how that's going to incorporate here in just a minute. But all of these are going to be working in conjunction with each other for the engine to crank, fire, and run when it's cold. So let's unpack this real quick. What we'll find here is in our cranking fuel table. This table right now, I have it based on the coolant temperature versus crank engine cycles, or crank cycles. What this is going to mean is every time we're cranking over the engine, it'll start to count up here in our axes. We also then obviously have based on coolant temperature. Now, in this particular situation, as we're looking at this, we're going to find that our coolant temperature, if we click in the table, we're going to find it's roughly 1920 Celsius. We can see we're at this specific location right here in the table. So our value here is 200%. What this is doing is multiplying whatever is coming from our airflow model to increase our pulse width in this specific condition. So when we're starting to crank over the engine, we'll have a big pulse width at it, and then as we start to go over time here, it's going to dissipate that as we're cranking and cranking. Once we get up here at about 6 engine crank cycles, it'll zero that out so we do not flood out the engine. Now, we do have a flood clear here. We have to be above 90% throttle to shut off the injectors under cranking. So if we're thinking that we're flooding out the engine, we don't have to pull out the spark plugs, try to clean them off. We can simply go full throttle. It'll shut the injectors down, doing a flood clear option, which is really nice. So we're going to see if these values in our default table from Motec are accurate. They should be fairly close. We'll see how it cranks, fires to run. So meaning, how many cranks does it take to fire off? Now, if we're finding we get an excessive amount of cranks, that can mean one of two things. One, we're not achieving cycle lock very quickly, so meaning there's something wrong with the Motec trying to detect the cam or crank pattern from what we've programmed under our ref sync area here. So let's go and jump and take a look at this real quick. So under setup, ref sync here, we're going to find our engine speed reference state should show cycle lock fairly quickly. If it doesn't, then we might need to adjust some values in here. So we'll have to unpack that. So that's going to be one potential cause of a hard start. Now, if it's showing cycle lock fairly quickly, that means the coils and injectors are getting fired properly. That means that we need more additional fuel. So that's just going to point towards that we have cranking fuel is inadequate. We need to add some additional cranking fuel in this table here. So we'll have to see how it cranks, fires, and it runs. Now, once it's fired up and running, we're going to find that we have our post-start fuel and our warm-up enrichment fuel. So the post-start's used for the first about 10 seconds here of the engine runtime. And then the warm-up here is going to be the kind of long-term steady state adder to be able to make sure that we're tracking to our fueling properly. So these two are going to go hand in hand. Post-start used for the first 10 seconds. You can see I've pretty much stopped it here at 10 seconds. And then warm-up enrichment here is going to be used as the engine's coming up to operating temperature. Now, I'm going to consider this engine to be up to operating temperature right around something like 50, 60 Celsius. So I'm going to make sure the table is zeroed out here. Likewise, it's very important in your post-start fuel table that the last column here is always zeroed out. Otherwise, it'll add this much percent across your entire air and fuel model, which is something that's not ideal. Likewise, with our warm-up enrichment, it can actually go in and have an offset across the entire air and fuel model, skewing our fueling up by whatever we have in these two tables here. Important that they're zeroed out when we want to have them completely gone away. Now, there is another factor in here. That's our lambda ECT offset. This is commanding a richer target lambda in the warm-up conditions. So looking at this, I'm normally targeting on a warm engine 1.0 lambda at idle. This is my idle area here. When we're finding that we're in a cold condition, so we can see here roughly 20 Celsius and below, we're going to target 90 lambda for idle. This is going to allow a little bit smoother operation and allow a little bit more engine torque output out of the engine. We'll find there is more frictional drag and loss on a cold engine, so naturally the engines want to try to idle lower when we're trying to get it to warm up and get it running. So I'm going to slightly increase the or I should say slightly decrease the target lambda, so slightly increasing the fueling base just purely on what we program right here. Once we're at 40 Celsius and higher, we can see these values are going to 2.0, meaning the Motec will always utilize the lowest command at lambda across all of the target lambda aim tables. So this is going to be bypassing. If we have it set at 2.0 lambda, it's full lean, it's not going to do anything with it. But this is going to be implemented here on the cold start, so we can take a look at that. Now, we also have our cranking airflow and our cranking spark timing. We shouldn't need to adjust these. We can find currently the airflow is at 100% on a cold engine. That should be good. We should find that probably cranks and fires fairly well with 100% contribution of the maximum throttle blade opening within the idle control routine. So let's flip over to idle control and talk about that. So under idle tuning here, under our actuator throttle aim, the maximum throttle is how much we're allowing in idle conditions and in startup to allow the throttle blade to open. So we have our feed forward table, we have our values in here. These values are a percentage of this throttle blade opening. So 0 to 100% scale, 100% means that we're opening the throttle blade the maximum of 10% programmed and called out for right here. Now this might vary depending on the engine and the throttle body you're working with. 10% seems to be an okay range for this particular vehicle, so I'm going to keep it at 10%. But this cranking idle mass flow is representative of this throttle angle under cranking conditions. Now once it cranks and it fires off, it'll go ahead and dissipate down to the normal feed forward values, and then the closed loop will take over and it starts to make some adjustments. Now we know on a warm engine, everything was good in terms of our idle speed. It was commanding proper idle, it was doing everything we were asking it for, and functioning properly. This table though may need to be tweaked a little bit, this feed forward table. If I click A here, I have the ability to set this based on coolant temperature. So I could set this table so it has an axis representing a warm coolant temperature and then another row here to represent a cold coolant temperature. We may need additional torque and airflow to achieve that torque through the throttle blade opening through the feed forward value. So we may have to call out a couple % higher throttle angle depending on how things look and depending how the control is going to go. It should be fairly close just using the singular axes. This again was all dialed in on a warm engine. Cold engine, we might need to increase some of the values. And again, we'll go ahead and put a row maybe at something like, looking here, something like 20 Celsius. And then another row called out here for something like 70 Celsius. So we could go here, if I just click OK, we can find that it's going to be set to all the same values. But again, we could go in here and increase these if needed for cold start if we're finding that the closed loop is trying to open the throttle blade more to reach that desired target program speed of, in this case, 1400 RPM. Now there is something else I'm going to do here within the idle control routine that I want to change up before we actually crank and fire over the engine. Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.